I'm Dave Trafford, and this is the 2030 Project. The 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. After 3 years of consultations, legislative crafting, committee reviews, and political pushing and pulling in the House of Commons and in the Senate in Ottawa, the Canada Disability Benefit Act finally received royal assent on June the 21st, 2023. It's intended to raise those living with disabilities in Canada out of poverty. Can it? Will it? In this episode, we'll take a 100,000-foot view of the Canadian Disability Benefit. The Liberal government has committed to co-designing the benefit with people with disabilities. That means adopting a nothing about us without us approach. It's novel, if not innovative, in its approach to this type of benefit program. Now, to help us, we're joined by advocates and activists from across the country, lived experience, and they've been on the front lines of the push to make the Canada Disability Benefit Act a reality. Let's meet our guests.
I'm Rabia Khedr, the National Director of Disability Without Poverty. I am also the CEO of DEEN Support Services, and I also happen to be a racialized woman with a disability. I'm blind.
My name is Belanger. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Indigenous Disability Canada and the British Columbia Aboriginal Network Disability Society.
Hi, I'm Amanda MacKenzie. I'm the National Director of Public Affairs at March of Dimes Canada.
Thanks for doing this. Just for purposes of context, I know you know that the Daily Bread Food Bank is the organization that is spearheading this effort, and this is part of the 2030 Project series that we've been working on, I guess, for the last couple of years. And Amanda, it's one of those things where I don't think that when we start to talk about poverty in a broad sense, that a lot of people think of poverty the way, the folks at the Daily Bread Food Bank do, for example. We have a sense of poverty as being over there. It's other people in other parts of the world. How can we possibly have poverty in a country as wealthy as we are here in Canada? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's really fair. I think we do. We think of poverty as being something we don't see necessarily in our day-to-day lives, but we do. And I think we very much need to broaden our concept of the people that experience poverty in this country in 2023.
And Rabia, when we begin to look at that sort of concept or that idea of poverty, clearly it has been reinforced or maybe even accelerated, if you want, thanks to COVID, because there are so many more people now who live in poverty or on the cusp of poverty because of what we went through in the pandemic. And I'm not cheering for the pandemic, but to some degree, it actually highlights the real problem that we do have in this country.
Well, the pandemic certainly exacerbated poverty for disabled people. Poverty existed. It just deepened and worsened during the pandemic and continues on that spiral of getting worse and worse as we recover through this pandemic with inflationary pressures.
And I guess, Neil, the idea that we can talk about various communities, and not to single them out, but the Indigenous communities have their own specific challenges in terms of social services that we know about, in terms of relationship with government, etc. How much more pronounced is the poverty concern in our First Nations in this country? And I'm making an assumption by saying how much more. Maybe I shouldn't do that.
No, well, certainly. I mean, from Stats Canada, we know that 80% of First Nations communities in Canada, there's approximately 635, 80% of them have a medium income below the poverty line. Indigenous people experience disability at a higher rate. We deal with, discrimination in relation to disability, but anti-Indigenous racism as well. And of course, all the factors that Rabia and Amanda have noted, increased inflation, lack of services, as you said, isolation, remote communities, all those things impact people's ability to be included in active members of their community, financially and socially. One of the, I guess, the cheering points, if we will, about the latest legislation passed by the federal government around the Canadian Disabilities Act, Benefits Act, is that there is this nothing about us without us, Rabia, that we're talking about. And I'm hearing sort of both sides of the coin here, where this is great because we need that specific community, your community's input into what is needed, what is necessary, what is adequate, etc. But on the other hand, I'm also hearing people say, man, this is really slowing things down. We're behind the eight ball already. We need to get money in the pipeline soon. And, is this going to slow it down? Where are you on that?
It doesn't have to slow it down. We're advocating for co-creation, that lived experience. Absolutely nothing about us without us has to be central to the development of the regulations. Disabled people know what disabled people need best. Able-bodied people do not. And given that fact, it may take more time simply because that's how bureaucracy operates. But we know that where there's will, there's a way to make things happen as quickly as possible. The system is going to take its time forming its regulations because it has its rules and ways of doing things, its culture in that, sort of bureaucratic space. But our job is to keep the pressure on and say, hurry up and get it done. And yes, you're not going to do it without us because you don't know what we need. We do.
Yeah, and Amanda, I think that resonates, I think, with a lot of people. It just makes sense in terms of how are we going to design a program like this. On the other hand, are there other jurisdictions that you know of that we can point to and say they're doing it correctly here because they have incorporated this lived experience in terms of their development of a program like this?
Do you know what? That's something that we've been looking for the last couple of years, is where does this precedent exist? And they are almost none.
Really?
We've been searching for some kind of precedent for co-creation of regulations. There's a little bit of one in Canada as it concerns things around banking and new ways of doing banking and that kind of thing. But that process has not gotten off the ground to any way that could provide a model for us here. So we're really working together as a community to build this model of what co-creation has to look like within a very short period of time. If we want this done as quickly as possible, we have to make recommendations that are going to get the job done. So,
Neil, on the one hand, it's exciting that we're able to be innovative, and I use that phrase advisedly, depending on how you want to approach it. But on the other hand, there's a bit of a fear factor here that we won't get it right, isn't there?
Well, I think so, and I think with any legislation and any benefit here, we're not going to get it right for everybody. We just can't. Disability is very diverse. The needs of individuals vary across the country. We want to get it right as much as we can. We want the benefit to be as generous as it possibly can be. When we're talking about the other questions that you asked the other panelists, we've been doing this now for 3 years. 3 years is too long. And when we have another 18 months to wait, that's too long. People need the money today. And co-creation is certainly a strong component of it. I'm not sure how involved the government will allow people, though, in certain aspects of it, which is a problem, right? So we talk about co-creation, and it's a good term. It's a good catchphrase. Nothing about us without us is a good phrase as well. But it'll come down to where the rubber meets the road if that actually happens, right? We suspect that a lot of work has been done already. There's a lot more that needs to do, but, frankly, all of us are kind of in the dark right now.
So who needs to hold the pen then on this, Neil, to make sure that we get off on the right foot? Because if we're on the wrong track, even by a couple of degrees, 18 months down the road, we're way off course.
Well, unfortunately, whether it's the federal government, provincial or territorial governments, they all have the way of doing things, right? And it all takes time. Like Rabia says, there's a bureaucracy here. We don't suspect on any level that there has been work being done. But there's a number of factors that have to come into play when we talk about clawbacks from the provinces or their territories or even the federal government. We don't know anything about those things. It's important that the disability community continues to lend their voice and to give directions to government to make sure that the pressure is on, like Robbie had said. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's going to be the government that does this. We need allies outside the disability community as well. They say, look, this is important. We need to. It can't just be the disability community because we're often cast aside or not given the priority that is necessary. We need non-disabled peoples to be allies. We need them to express their voice to government. We need corporations to. We need cities, mayors, councils to say, look, you have to support our community members living with disabilities and to the maximum amount possible. And we've seen during COVID that things can happen quickly, and we think things should happen quickly here. And making sure that we consider the phenomenally extra cost and frustration that persons with disabilities have to deal with every day.
Well, and Rabia, I think that the costs that the persons living with disability have to face every day is one issue, but there's a cost to society for people to have to suffer through the indignity of poverty, right? I mean, not to be able to support your household, your family, whatever it may be, because of the lack of fund and support for those living with disability. There's a cost to that. I mean, it seems to me that we can't afford not to do this properly.
Absolutely. We cannot afford to let this continue, because what we're seeing right now is over 50% of food bank users, people food insecure, are disabled people. Over 41% of people living in poverty are actually disabled people, and rising. The data is even lacking in this area. What we're finding is that, people with disabilities, if they don't have the financial dignity that they need, that impacts their well-being in other ways. That exacerbates their physical disabilities. If the nature of their disability has physical symptoms, so they need more access to healthcare. It causes more emotional and psychological trauma living with poverty. They require more mental health interventions. So, regardless of the supports, people are struggling right now. And if we think that the benefit is going to cost us, there are costs that we are not calculating up to the state of poverty that people with disabilities are in right now. And the message that we're sending as a society to disabled people is, you know what? If your disability is so bad, you're struggling so much, the poverty that you're experiencing is exacerbating your dignity and quality of life, then guess what? Here's an easy out. There's medical assistance in dying as an option. And that's really a cost-benefit analysis of it's cheaper for the system. It's no longer about savings to the system. There's a cost to the system ongoing. And it's really time to do right by disabled people. It's time for systems change, because we saw the system really changed in an instant when it came to able-bodied working-age Canadians during the pandemic lockdown.
Amanda, when I hear Rabia put it that way, so matter-of-factly, particularly vis-a-vis MAID, there was a time when we never, ever, ever would have had those words uttered in that order. Now it's not just a possibility. It's a fact of condition in life for people.
Yeah, it is. And this is unacceptable. I think you've seen all of us in the community fight against, certainly Neil and Rabia's organizations have led on fighting against MAID for people with disabilities just because of these reasons. And it's totally unacceptable. And our position is that the services and the programs and the benefits to ensure the financial security and health and well-being and dignity of people with disabilities is where we have to be putting our resources, our policy work, all of the, the levers of government should be focused in those areas and not on providing people, made as a way out of poverty. It's outrageous. And it's just, it's unacceptable in society in this day and age.
Yeah, I don't know anybody who would be saying, oh, that's a good idea. I don't know anybody in my circle. And it just doesn't make any kind of sense to me. But let's get down in the weeds a little bit here, because each of you in your own way has described the broad strokes. This is needed. Timing is an issue, but we'll get there. There's some light at the end of the tunnel, and we hope it's not a train, all those sorts of things. But at the same time, and I think Neil alluded to this, we're talking about a federal framework right now. We still don't have a lot of meat on those bones. And then it has to kind of trickle down, whatever, to the provincial level, where here in Ontario, we've got ODSP, which is entirely inadequate already. How do those things compare? We have the varying jurisdictions that are going to have to straighten out who gets what, back to the whole issue of clawback. On the surface of it, Amanda, this sounds like, well, it'll be a universal plan right across the country. Are you going to have more benefits in Atlantic Canada than you will in Quebec or Manitoba based on the way this framework is going to roll out? Because each one province is going to be able to say, this is how we're going to administer this plan, and this is the dollar value we're going to attach to it.
So just getting into the weeds a little bit on this. So, I mean, first of all, a lot of those questions are going to be worked out in regulations, but the intention of the benefit is that it's modeled on the guaranteed income supplement for seniors, right? So that is a universal benefit across the country. It doesn't matter where you live. It is entirely income and age dependent, right? Like, you've got to be 65 and you've got to have a certain, a relatively low income in order to receive the maximum. So assuming that that's the model for the Canada Disability Benefit, it would be, if you're in New Brunswick and you get $850 a month from your provincial disability income support, then you get the Canada Disability Benefit on top of that to an amount of money per month, which is the same for everybody in New Brunswick. But it sure as heck isn't going to be the same for everybody in Alberta, where they're much more generous with their provincial disability income support. Like, I think it's just about $1,800 a month in ASHs right now. And so if you're giving the same amount of money to the person in New Brunswick that you're giving to Alberta, there's going to be a significant breadth between the two persons with a disability. So the question is the person in New Brunswick going to choose to move to Alberta, or like, how is that going to work? And these are all things that have to be worked out in the regulations process. And I think it's also a big reason why we're insisting on the government fulfilling its commitment to true co-creation that the minister has said in any number of public fora over the last year.
So, Neil, when we hear that, that really succinct assessment of where the money is going to come from, how it's going to be applied, who gets it, what are realistic expectations? Let me put it that way around this. And because I'm already hearing people say, I'll take anything. Whatever I get is good enough. I'm not sure that's the base, but at some point, just if there are already inequities built into the system that we're trying to resolve, if region to region, we only exacerbate those and make it more difficult. Or, I don't know, where should our expectations lie?
Well, we should have high expectations for federal and provincial governments to do what's right. That's the first thing. As far as the benefit itself, how it's going to roll out and what the rate will be, I have no idea. Like, I don't know. I don't know what the number will be. We've always advocated for people should be at a minimum receiving $2,400 a month. And that's at a minimum. In the legislation now, it says that the government has to take into consideration the cost of disability. So we'd say tack that onto it then. Our expectation would be, like I said, it would be a minimum of $2,400. That's the bottom rung, and go higher. Whether that's the government's expectation, I don't know. For provincial and territorial governments, whether they'll claw back or not, we don't know. We don't know anything yet. And we've talked here in British Columbia with the government here to get some kind of insight into it and say, would you exempt this when it comes through? but they don't have the details either. So until they know what the rate will be, it's difficult for them to say because it impacts their other programs. So right now we're in a big limbo. Within the disability community, if you look online virtually, you'll see that there's, some people are really happy. They're saying this is great news. We're moving forward. It's a good thing. It is great news. Other people are a little bit more cautious. They're saying, well, we're not going to expect a lot. Maybe it's not going to come in anyways. We don't really know. So there's a large range of viewpoints and a large range of feelings that people have in relation to the benefit. We've always remained positive and said, look, this is a good thing. We've got to keep the pressure up to make sure it's as high as we can get. But I don't think the government is going to make anybody rich. I don't think they're going to all of a sudden see a benefit that's, people are making are receiving $40,000 a year. So again, there's still so much work to be done, with the regulations, with the framework, and with the provinces and territories. So it's hard to say.
Let me ask you this. Are there specific issues that need to be addressed in our First Nations and Indigenous communities, particularly there, vis-a-vis disability?
Absolutely. Accessibility is a huge factor. Accessibility within communities, remoteness, access to transportation, anti-Indigenous racism, systemic poverty, access to nutritious food supplies. We can go on. We've got the list upon list. And when we talk about things, and we talk about medical assistance in dying, we talk about accessibility. So of course we know that in 2019, I believe, the Accessible Canada Act came through. But First Nations are exempt. So Canada's 635 First Nations are exempt from the Accessible Canada Act, which would make their communities more accessible, right? While the government says they're going to do more consultations. If we look at medical assistance in dying, we testified at HUMA and we testified at the AMAD committee, as well did other Indigenous organizations and representatives, and we all spoke against the advancement of MAID, saying there's been no contact, no consultation, no real engagement with Indigenous people across Canada. Despite that, and the special reports that came out, MAID continues to expand, and it goes back to what we were saying. MAID saves money where the Accessible Canada Act would cost money. So in both cases, no consultations has been recognized. In one case, they've delayed implementation because it would cost money. In medical assistance in dying, it actually saves money. So we get these different things coming through that affect, our communities, our members living with disabilities, mental illness. Recommendations have come for mature minors. That it's not in law yet, but recommendations from the committee have said we should consider mature minors under Track 1. And if Track 1 is put in place, we'll guarantee that Track 2 will be put in place. So mature minors with disabilities. So these are all things that are happening, with the pre-existing things that have always existed long before the pandemic, ever came about. So yeah, multiple barriers.
Rabia, how important is this? And again, go back to nothing about us without us, for this legislation and this program to be a living, organic thing, as opposed to something that is set in a legislative stone. And I say that because, as Neil points out, we're looking at evolutions in terms of cultural perceptions, acceptability of certain programs or not. But I guess even the definitions and criteria of eligibility has to be a living, breathing thing, no?
Well, and that's one of the reasons that this bill is actually a framework bill. This law is a framework piece of legislation, and we agreed to supporting it in that way, is that regulations are a little easier to adapt over time as things change. We didn't want a dollar figure identified in the actual legislation because today's minimum dollar figure will be tomorrow's maximum depending on the flavor of government. Now, there's a few things that we're doing to make sure that co-creation happens in a meaningful way and that our voices are heard. As you said, provinces vary in the supports that they offer. And this has the risk of it being a cash grab for provinces. We're organizing province by province to get people with disabilities and their families, their friends, their allies and supporters to raise their voices, to make sure that provincial counterparts of the federal government get the same message of no clawbacks. And, there's a lot more work to be done. They have obligations that they have to uphold year over year, like indexing their provincial benefits so that we stay with the times, and we're not falling behind like people with disabilities are today, where their provincial incomes or whatever income sources they have are 40% below the poverty line. Let's get people above the poverty line is the goal that we have in mind, that we want to see become reality. And that's only going to happen if everybody works together, which is what we've been mobilizing for. We've brought together philanthropy, the broader nonprofit sector, corporate Canada, together working with us in our public relations and government relations strategy so that we speak based on key principles to ensure that the voices of people with disabilities are front and center in this journey, and that this benefit does not become a token benefit, but becomes genuinely a life changer for people with disabilities.
So let me just take that the next step then. Is there something that you can point to that makes you optimistic that that will happen? And I go back to the provincial disability pensions right now and the programs that they have. And I'm more familiar with what's going on in Ontario. If only that were indexed, if only that, we were adding more to it on an annual basis based on inflation, that would be an improvement to it. I mean, governments are quite happy to pat themselves on the back for seem to be doing busy work. And in some cases, this is what applies to this kind of a program. We're going to give you, another $50 a month or something, as if that made any difference. And it doesn't, but they can tick a box. So I'm being the skeptic here. Point to something that gives you optimism that this is going to work.
Well, Dave, we saw that our voices were heard so far. We've pushed forward with this bill becoming law, and it became law. If we as people with disabilities and service providers and stuff were complacent about it and left it to government to do on its own, it wouldn't have even happened. Even though we've said it's taken too long, it would have taken even longer or would have never happened if we didn't give voice to the issues of disability poverty. So I'm very optimistic that within that same spirit, mobilizing province by province, we will get provincial governments to do right by disabled people. In Ontario, there's the ODSP Action Coalition that's been working for a long time, raising the needs to the provincial government. We know that finally there were increases, though quite small, but there have been increases to ODSP in Ontario, the income for people with disabilities in Ontario. And we're hoping that in that same spirit, the other piece actually we saw government do in Ontario is increase the earnings exemption to $1,000 a month. That's a big move as far as I'm concerned. And to me, that signals that they are not going to claw back a federal benefit, because then they're contradicting their own policy change. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm optimistic. Yeah. And you know what? I'm one of those
we
people.
need you to be optimistic.
Dave, I'm one of those people who says every obstacle is an opportunity. So I'm the forever optimist that, we can make change happen as long as we work wholeheartedly and together.
Amanda, and I will say, and I'm sort of playing devil's advocate around the problems with it. I will say on a positive note, in the last election campaign here in Ontario, we had all four major parties acknowledging that the disability pension program was inadequate and that they were all going to address it. Now, the degree to which they were willing to put money on the table was varying, but there wasn't a party that said, oh, no, you get enough already. It's fine the way it is. So that political movement, it sounds small, but I would think given where we are with the federal bill, that's promising.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's a real shift, right? Like we didn't see that in the previous election. These were not things that parties were making commitments to, like even Liberal governments in Ontario before, like they set the earnings exemption at $200 a month, right? And weren't increasing ODSP by any reasonable amount, at any time. So now we almost, it's great to see that we have four political parties in Ontario that are saying we want to increase ODSP. The Ford government did so, and then they indexed it to inflation. So ODSP is going up 6.5% at the end of July. So the July payment will have an increase to it. And I mean, the cynic in me, which I'm not usually a cynic at all, but I think what has happened is that every provincial government is seeing this Canada Disability Benefit is incoming. And so they're saying we're going to increase things, by a token amount, to get to at least show we're on board with increasing provincial disability income supports. But they can also see down the road, right? Like, I mean, I used to work in a minister's office, and I could tell you that's exactly what I would have been thinking was, there's this federal benefit that's coming. So, how much more does the province need to do when it's the federal government that has the deep pockets?
Neil, I just want to get to kind of next steps, because we're way down the road here in terms of the cash going out the door already. How quickly do we need some signal from the government to know, what does this group look like that is actually going to be consulted and actually have some input into this if we're going to hit that 12-month, 18-month target?
Well, I think the government has a plan. I think through the regular legislation process, using the Gazette and doing their standard procedure, I don't think we're going to see a big, community consultation. They've done a lot already prior to this. They've met with groups, and they've done an online survey looking at all different things of the Disability Inclusion Action Plan, this type of thing. So I wouldn't. We've had discussions about how it might look, and will they be doing some community roundtables, this type of stuff. I'm not confident that they will. I think that there will be some online component to it. There will be some focus groups have, but as far as something being humongous, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think they have enough time to do it, and I don't think if we look at what they did with the Accessible Canada Act, for example, and they went all around Canada and met with communities and groups, this kind of stuff. I don't think we'll see anything like that. I think it'll be much smaller.
Is that good or bad?
Well, it's been 3 years. And, from our perspective here, 3 years in consultation to determine that persons with disabilities live in poverty and they need support is probably about 2 years, 11 months, and 15 days too long of a consultation process, because this is information we all knew. So, I mean, if we're going to, what more can the government know about poverty and disability that they don't know already? These things have been here for generations. We talk about what you were talking about before about Ontario raising the rates, and here in BC they just raised the shelter rates to $500 from $375. First time, I forget, in 17 years or something like that. But these are issues that we've been dealing with for decades. We talk about the same things that I talked about 25 years ago, and there seems to be an idea that from governments, federally, provincial, territorial, if persons with disabilities just get a job, then things will be better. So when we talk about employment exemptions, those type of things, those are all really good things. They look good on paper. But unfortunately, the vast majority of people with disabilities are unable to secure, positions because of discrimination, because their disability prohibits it, because of their location, transportation issues, all the things. So those are all good. But we hear that from governments all the time. If people with disabilities just get a job, their lives be. So let's pump more money into disability programs, right? And we have to take a different look on this type of thing. So, and again, these are not new things that have just developed. These are things that we've known for years and years. The consultation process for this bill took way too long. Do people want the money? We want to know, there's key things we need to know. What are the eligibility criteria, right? Who's going to be eligible? It's going to be people who are in provincial, federal, territorial assistance now. Application process for people that aren't on it but may be eligible in other provinces, because we have 13 jurisdictions and 13 different criteria within those jurisdictions. So they don't mirror each other. It's not a standard thing. Disability is not a standard thing across Canada. You might be eligible in BC, but the same person may not be eligible in Alberta because of their criteria. So we've got to get that done, what the rate will be. And that has to be worked out with the province. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And unfortunately, it will take too much time. It's going to take too much time. People needed the money yesterday. They needed it the week before, the year before, 3 years before, 3 decades before. So I don't know. That's really not an answer to anything, Dave. It's just
but you were on a good roll. I'm really that was great. No, seriously, I think you've nailed it in terms of being able to say how much more talking should we be doing. We need to be walking the walk, months ago already on this. And you get to my point around, it sounds like a national program so that there is equality across the country, but we've got different criteria. So, we're really going to have to get down and hammer that stuff out. We had a first shot at doing it right to set it on its proper course. Amanda, just before we go, if as you look at the map here across the country and where the disability programs are already in place and in varying degrees, whatever that dollar figure is or how easy or complicated it is to apply, I looked into it. It's not easy to actually meet the standard for a disability pension here in Ontario anyway. Is there a province that is sort of should be the first target of the federal government to say, we're going to strike the deal with you first, because that's going to set the best tone right across the country and make all the other provinces have to at least meet that standard?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to be honest, I don't know the answer to it, but I think there are issues in all the provinces. And I think maybe what we can do is look to some other province by province, territory by territory agreements that the federal government has struck and see what those agreements look like and which have been the ones that have kind of set the precedent for the rest of the country to say, well, everybody else has to fall in line. But I really want to touch on your accessibility point, right? Like the accessibility of disability income supports right across this country is incredibly challenging. And, we're really focused at March of Dimes on the accessibility of this benefit and what that looks like. And and as such, it's been necessary to look across the country to see how people access provincial territorial disability income support programs, how they access other types of disability support programs. Maybe it's not income based, but it's more service based, and it's a hellscape right across the country. It's just too hard, and having a disability in and of itself presents day-to-day challenges that the rest, those of us who don't experience disability day-to-day even think about. And it's exhausting, and it often costs money, and, physicians are not remunerated for filling in forms. And so it costs people money to do these things, to access the benefits and credits that they are entitled to by law. And that is a real focus for us, and making sure that as these agreements are struck across the country, that accessibility of programs of the benefit itself is really a centerpiece and meets a world-class standard.
So, Rabia, final word to you. Just I'm hearing there's the dollar value, the dollar figure that's going to be attached to it, and that's what the public in general will probably respond to. But those living with disabilities across the country, I think, are going to touch more on the question of criteria and accessibility. They go hand in hand. How important is it, from your perspective, that criteria be really standardized across the country? Or is there room or a need for there to be regional differences?
When it comes to eligibility criteria, there should be one definition of disability. There is such a variance in that across the country. For example, the amount in Alberta might be very high, but the number of people that fit into their definition is quite restrictive. As you said, in Ontario, for example, it's so challenging for you to even get through the process of accessing the benefit. Criteria needs to be standardized. The definition of disability needs to be agreed upon across the country to make sure that there is indeed equity in the accessibility of the benefit, and that nobody's left behind, because this is nothing about us without us. And that us is everybody living with a disability in this country. Now, when numbers are important to disabled people, they are asking, how much is this benefit going to be? They want it to be meaningful. They want it to give them the dignity that they deserve. Right now, for example, Ontario's doing, slow little increases. So, a year ago, my brother received $1,073 as one individual living in a group living facility. which the bulk of that went to the place where he lives, and he had like $50 left to spend. They increased it and it went up to $12.28, and he got an extra $5 to spend after the increase from the institution that he lives in. Now it's going up to $13.05. I'm waiting to see what the organization where he lives is going to do in terms of their next rate hike. And I will be very upset about it because, yes, my brother has family to help him out. Not everybody does. And people are living that below the poverty line is unacceptable. This is not my Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you describe a whole nuanced issue around accessibility where there's family support that doesn't really show up on a form per se. It's an important part of the conversation. Listen, thanks to you, Rabia and Neil and Amanda, for getting us going. It's an important discussion, and we know you'll be watching it closely, and we will as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.